Joseph Barboza was born on September 20, 1932, in New Bedford, Massachusetts, to Portuguese emigrants from Valpaços in the Alto Tras os Montes. Joseph Barboza Sr., born José Barbosa, a middleweight boxer, and Palmeira Camille, who was a seamstress. The waterfront community of New Bedford was a rough place to grow up, where immigrant families struggled to make ends meet, and young men often turned to their fists to settle disputes. Although Barboza had less than an eighth-grade education and was barely literate, he was fluent in Portuguese, Italian, and Spanish. These language skills would later serve him well in the multicultural underworld of organized crime. From an early age, Joe showed signs of the violence that would define his life. Barboza was a stocky, muscular man with a thick neck and an angular, watermelon-shaped skull. He became involved in criminal activity, including robberies and assaults, as a teenager. But it wasn't just random violence. There was something calculated about the way young Barboza approached conflict, something that caught the attention of older criminals in the neighborhood. His father was a Los Angeles-based prize fighter who competed in only 2 professional boxing matches. His debut bout was against Pete Frisco on January 27, 1933, and his second match was against Carlos Chipres on April 27, 1933. Perhaps it was this brief connection to legitimate violence that inspired Joe to try his hand at boxing. His first boxing match on April 18, 1949, against Rocky Lucero in El Paso, Texas, and his last fight on September 23, 1961, against Don Bale in Boston. His boxing record shows Joseph as winning 8 out of the 11 matches, with 5 of them ending in knockouts. He was classified as an outfighter who was known for having very powerful punches, but boxing couldn't contain Barboza's rage. The rules, the referees, the controlled environment. It was all too limiting for someone who preferred to fight without restrictions. Barboza was first sent to prison at the age of 18 in 1950 to the Massachusetts Correctional Institution, Concord, for 5 years. This early incarceration would become a pattern that defined much of his adult life. In 1953, he would lead a wild prison, break the largest in the prison's 75-year history. Barboza and 6 other fellow inmates had guzzled contraband, whiskey, and pilfered amphetamine tablets, overpowered 4 prison guards, and raced away in 2 separate cars. The escape revealed something fundamental about Barboza's character. He couldn't be contained, couldn't follow rules, couldn't submit to authority. During their furlough of freedom, they beat random people in the street, cruised the bars in Boston, wandered neighborhoods, and were finally apprehended at a subway station in East Boston. The escape party had barely lasted 24 hours. Back in prison, Barboza's violence only escalated. In November of the same year, while awaiting trial for his prison break, Barboza slugged a prison guard in the cafeteria for no reason. Then 3 months later, he tossed a table at a guard's chest when he entered his cell. These weren't calculated moves to gain respect or establish dominance. They were explosions of pure rage, the actions of a man who couldn't control his own violent impulses. He later worked as a longshoreman and as a clerk in a fruit store, but always returned to crime. The legitimate world held no appeal for Barboza. Every attempt at honest work ended the same way, with him gravitating back to the streets, back to the violence that seemed to define his very existence. It was during another stint in prison that Barboza's life took a crucial turn. He first became trusted by Boston organized crime members during his time in Walpole Prison. Many of these guys, they you make your bones in a way, not by killing somebody, but by going to prison and not, talking about anybody and then how you conduct yourself in prison. A prison is like a training ground for a lot of guys, and mob will swatch these guys and see how they conduct themselves in prison. The 1960s Boston underworld was a battlefield. Irish gangs from Charlestown and Somerville were at war with each other. Independent bookmakers were trying to carve out their own territories, and the Italian-American Patriarca crime family was attempting to maintain control over it all. The Patriarca crime family, Patria Arca, Italian pronunciation, Patriarca, also known as the New England Mafia, the Boston Mafia, the Providence Mafia, The Boston Providence Mafia, or The Office, is an Italian-American mafia crime family operating in New England. Raymond Patriarca became boss of the family in 1954 and led the organization from the Federal Hill neighborhood of Providence until his death in 1984. Under Patriarca's leadership, the family profited primarily from illegal gambling, loan sharking, pornography, and trafficking in stolen goods. Born on Sept 20, 1932, in New Bedford, Massachusetts, Barboza had Portuguese heritage but dreamt of joining La Cosa Nostra despite the organization's exclusive entry to Italians. He would never be accepted formally, but did become an enforcer for Raymond Patriarca's New England Mafia, violently proving his mettle. This was the fundamental contradiction of Barboza's life. He desperately wanted to belong to an organization that would never fully accept him as one of their own. In the 1960s, when Patriarca allied his smaller Providence-based gang with Irish and independent ethnic mobsters, the bloody McLean-McLaughlin gang war raged in Boston. In 1965, in desperate need of hitmen and enforcers to gain control for his mob family in Boston, Patriarca recruited Barboza. The 34-year-old used his talents to blunt the work of the independents. He claimed to have killed 26 people during the more than 3-year war that claimed nearly 50 lives. The nickname The Animal wasn't given lightly. Joseph Barboza, also known as The Animal, due to the fact he bit a man's ear during a bar brawl, was born 20th September 1932 in New Bedford, Massachusetts. But it wasn't just the ear-biting incident that earned him the moniker. It was his complete lack of restraint, his willingness to use violence in ways that shocked even hardened criminals. Based on his years as a crazed hitman, street loan collector and intimidator for Raymond Patriarca's New England Mafia, Joe the Animal Barboza should have recognized he might have been set up. But recognition requires reflection, and Barboza was a man of action, not thought. He lived in the moment, driven by impulse and rage. During the height of his power, Barboza was untouchable. Joseph Barboza had such a strong personality that a bar he frequented when he was out was called Barboza's Corner. He had become a legend in Boston's underworld, a boogeyman that mothers used to frighten their children into obedience. But with that notoriety came scrutiny, both from law enforcement and from his own supposed allies. In January 1966, Barboza was considered a powerful crime figure in the Boston underworld and was often represented by F. Lee Bailey, which proved to be a huge mistake. But he was also facing major problems. Authorities were watching him like a hawk. They were constantly on his heels. By 1966, his position in the Boston underworld can only be described as turbulent. The turning point came with a simple traffic stop. Then in 1966, police arrested Barboza on gun charges when officers pulled him over and discovered an arsenal in his car. For a man who had committed dozens of murders, it seemed like a minor setback. But what happened next would change everything. In jail, he expected Patriarca to post his enormous $100,000 bail, but the boss refused. When some of Barboza's crime associates raised more than $80,000 toward it, Patriarca had 3 of them killed and their money taken. 2 of his associates, Bratsos and DePrisco, went to raise Barboza's bail. 5 weeks later, after raising $59,000, the pair were murdered in the Night Light Cafe by soldiers serving under Ralphie Chong Lamatina, who served in the crew of Ilario Zanino. After relieving them of their bail money, they stuffed their bodies in the back seat of Bratsos' car and dumped it in South Boston, hoping to throw blame onto the Irish gangs. The message was clear. Barboza had become too dangerous, too unpredictable, too much of a liability. The same violence that had made him valuable to the organization now made him expendable. Things took a turn when he was arrested on gun charges in 1966, however, and Patriarca refused to put up his bail, and killed anyone else who offered to. Sensing their chance to turn Barboza against his boss, the FBI offered him immunity and a new life in San Francisco if he gave up Patriarca. The FBI began diligent efforts to turn Barboza into an informant. In the summer of 1967, Steve Flemmi met with Joseph and informed him that Gennaro Angiulo and his brothers had plans to murder him. The FBI's approach came at exactly the right moment. Barboza, sitting in jail, abandoned by the organization he'd killed for, realized he had been betrayed. The rage that had always defined him now had a new target. The FBI were desperate to turn Barboza into an informant, and when Barboza was sent to prison on a 5-year term at Walpole, Barboza turned informant, eventually testifying against Raymond Patriarca, before becoming one of the first informants to enter the Witness Protection Program. The government told Barboza his wife and children would not be protected unless he agreed to testify. The government also promised to set him up in his own restaurant and plastic surgery to change his appearance, and further protect Barboza and his family. But it did not fulfill either of these promises, but Barboza's cooperation with the FBI would lead to one of the darkest chapters in American law enforcement history. Joseph Salvati, 72, and Peter Limone, 74, were exonerated in 2001 after a state judge found that FBI agents hid wiretap tapes and other information from state prosecutors to protect an FBI informant and former mob hitman, Joseph the Animal Barboza. Barboza was a known mob assassin responsible for numerous hits during Boston's gangland wars of the 1960s. He was also so vital to FBI efforts to crack the mob that the agency allowed him to frame 4 men for murder. Attorneys for the plaintiffs said in opening statements, "The murder of Edward Teddy Deegan in 1965 would become the centerpiece of this travesty of justice." Deegan was shot and killed in an alley next to an office building in Chelsea, Massachusetts at approximately 9:30 p.m. In 1967, police charged 6 men with Deegan's murder, and at trial, the prosecution's primary witness was Federal Bureau of Investigation criminal informant Joseph Barboza. On July 31, 1968, the court convicted Louis Greco, Henry Tamelio, Ronald Casesso, and Peter Limone of Deegan's murder and sentenced them to the death penalty. Joseph Salvati and Roy French were sentenced to life imprisonment as accessories to Deegan's murder. The truth was far more sinister. Days before Deegan was shot in the head in a Chelsea alley, FBI wiretaps caught Barboza and Vincent "Jimmy" Flemmi asking a Rhode Island mob boss for permission for the hit. Informants later told FBI agents that Barboza, Flemmi, and 3 other men were responsible. FBI agent Paul Rico, who handled top echelon informants, listed Deegan as among 7 people killed by Flemmi. According to these files, Joseph Barboza, Ronald Casella, Jimmy Flemmi, and Wilfred French had carried out the murder, and Greco, Limone, Tamelio, and Salvati were falsely convicted of the murder with FBI complicity. The FBI knew the truth from the beginning, but they had made a calculation. Barboza and Jimmy Flemmi were too valuable as informants to lose. The innocent men were, in the Bureau's cold terminology, acceptable collateral damage. Garrow also obtained an affidavit from an inmate who once celled next to Barboza in prison. The inmate, William Garraway, said Barboza admitted numerous murders and double crosses, including framing Salvati. Garraway gave Garrow correspondence showing that he repeatedly informed Massachusetts prosecutors of Barboza's admissions and was repeatedly ignored. Garraway, as well as a number of Boston defense lawyers, including one of Barboza's lawyers, Lee Bailey, say that Barboza lied at the Deegan trial, wrongly implicating Salvati and others with the knowledge of law enforcement authorities. Bailey said Barboza did it because Salvati owed him $400 and because he wanted to satisfy the FBI's desire to lock up members of the mafia. $400. That was the price of Joseph Salvati's innocence. Barboza wanted Salvati's debt paid immediately, but Salvati was unable to pay and stole the baseball bat from one of Barboza's enforcers, who had been sent to collect the $400. A few days later, Salvati was arrested for the murder of Terry Deegan, a man who Salvati had never even heard of before. Barboza's testimony about Patriarca ordering the slaying of an independent dice game operator, Willie Marfeo, resulted in a murder conspiracy conviction in 1970 for the mafia boss and 2 others. Patriarca got 10 years in prison. The sentencing was a huge blow to the Patriarca leadership and a big victory for the FBI and Justice Department. He was paroled in March 1969 under the name of Joseph Bentley and relocated to Santa Rosa, California, where he enrolled in a culinary arts school. The FBI had kept part of their bargain, giving Barboza a new identity and a new life 3,000 miles from Boston. But they couldn't give him a new personality, couldn't change the fundamental nature of the man they had unleashed on an unsuspecting California. In summer 1970, Barboza murdered Clay Wilson. According to the FBI, this was the 26th murder by Barboza. In 1971, he pleaded guilty to a second-degree murder charge and was sentenced to 5 years at Folsom Prison. Even in witness protection, even with a new name and a new life, Barboza couldn't stop killing. The violence wasn't just a means to an end for him, it was who he was. In 1970, he met a small-time crook named Clayton Ricky Wilson, who confided in Barboza about money and other valuables he had stolen during burglaries. According to Paulette Ramos, a 19-year-old friend of Wilson and his wife Dee, Barboza got into an argument with Wilson. He shot and killed Wilson, buried him in a shallow grave, covered it with a tree stump, and frightened the two women into keeping their mouths shut. Barboza killed a man in Santa Rosa, and at trial, his true identity came out. After serving 5 years in prison, Barboza moved to San Francisco and lived in an apartment near Ocean Beach. His cover blown, his protection compromised, Barboza was now living on borrowed time. Meanwhile, back in Boston, the truth about the Deegan murder was slowly coming to light. Tamayo and Greco died in prison after serving almost 30 years, and Salvati and Limone were finally released in 1997 and 2001, respectively. The families of Greco, Tamayo, Salvati, and Limone filed lawsuits totaling in excess of $1 billion filed against the federal government. In July 2007, U.S. District Judge Nancy Gertner in Boston found the Bureau helped convict the 4 men and the U.S. government, was ordered to pay $100 million in damages to the 4 defendants. It took 30 years to uncover this injustice, and the government's position is, in a word, absurd, U.S. District Judge Nancy Gertner said Thursday. No lost liberty is dispensable, she told the packed courtroom. The judge's words were a damning indictment of an FBI that had lost its way, that had become so focused on making cases against organized crime, that it had forgotten the most basic principle of justice, that innocent people should not be punished for crimes they didn't commit. The report condemned the FBI's use of known murderers as informants, the FBI's shielding of those murderers from prosecution, and the FBI's use of perjurious testimony by murderers to knowingly convict innocent people. But by the time these words were written, by the time justice was finally served, it was too late for Henry Tamayo and Louis Greco, who had died in prison for a crime they didn't commit. As for Barboza, his past finally caught up with him on February 11, 1976. But on February 11, 1976, Barboza, once assigned by the feds to live in Santa Rosa, California under the name Joe Donati, went to visit his old friend and mob associate James Chalmers in San Francisco's sleepy Sunset District. He had been set up by Chalmers, who earlier tipped off Patriarca family underboss Gennaro Jerry Angiulo, Zanino and mob soldier Joseph Russo, to watch for when Barboza left Chalmers' residence near the corner of 25th Avenue and Moraga Street. On February 11, 1976, Barboza left Chalmers' San Francisco apartment. As he was walking to his car, he was hit by 4 shotgun blasts at close range. He was killed instantly. Although he was armed with a Colt .38, Barboza never had a chance to draw it. The man who had lived by violence died by violence, gunned down on a quiet street far from the Boston neighborhoods where he had made his name. F. Lee Bailey was quoted as having said Barboza's death was no great loss to society. It was a cold epitaph for a cold man, but perhaps a fitting one. He was shot dead in San Francisco in 1976 after his whereabouts became known to Patriarca underboss Gennaro Angiulo. The mob's reach was long, its memory longer. They had waited almost a decade, but they had finally settled their accounts with the man who had betrayed them. Looking back at Joseph Barboza's life, it's tempting to see him simply as a monster, a violent sociopath who left a trail of death and destruction in his wake. And certainly he was all of those things. He admitted to killing 26 men when he was a loan shark and a hired assassin for mob boss Raymond Patriarca. 26 lives ended, 26 families destroyed, all to satisfy the bloodlust of a man who seemed incapable of any emotion except rage. But Barboza's story is more than just a catalog of violence. It's a cautionary tale about what happens when law enforcement loses its moral compass, when the desire to make cases against organized crime becomes more important than justice itself. The use of FBI informants for the wrongful conviction of 4 innocent men is noteworthy because it unveiled the corrupt activities that occurred in the FBI during the 1960s. Radio talk host Howie Carr would later surmise, for the FBI, it was more important to keep Vincent, and later Barboza, on the street as informants than it was to prevent the framing of innocent men. In fact, the railroading of the 4 men served 2 purposes for the FBI. It would enable Vincent and Joseph Barboza to escape conviction for a murder they had committed, and it would also remove several Patriarca crime family members or associates from the criminal world that the FBI had not been able to eliminate in a legal manner. The tragedy of Joseph Barboza extends beyond his victims to his own family. He was married to a Jewish woman and fathered a daughter in 1965 and also a son, and lived in Chelsea, Massachusetts, while employed by the Patriarca crime family. On the other hand, Barboza's young daughter never recovered from her father's death. She was the ultimate innocent victim, a child who grew up knowing her father was a killer, who lost him to the violence that had defined his entire life. In the end, Joseph, the animal, Barboza's legacy is one of destruction, not just the lives he took, but the lives he helped destroy through his false testimony, the corruption he enabled within law enforcement, and the precedent he set for the misuse of the witness protection program. He was a man who wanted desperately to belong, to be accepted into the exclusive brotherhood of La Cosa Nostra, but who was forever marked as an outsider by his Portuguese blood. That rejection, combined with his volcanic temper and complete lack of moral restraint, created a perfect storm of violence that consumed everything in its path. When the mob that had used him as a weapon decided he was too dangerous to live, they eliminated him with the same cold efficiency he had once employed on their behalf. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Barboza's story is how ordinary evil can become when it's institutionalized. The FBI agents who allowed innocent men to be framed weren't monsters. They were bureaucrats who had convinced themselves that the ends justified the means. The mobsters who ordered murders weren't insane. They were businessmen protecting their interests. And Barboza himself, for all his animal savagery, was ultimately just a man looking for respect and belonging. In all the wrong places. His death on that San Francisco street in 1976 closed one chapter in the dark history of organized crime in America. But the questions his life raises remain relevant today. How far should law enforcement go in pursuit of criminals? What happens when those sworn to uphold the law break it themselves? And what creates men like Joseph Barboza, men capable of such extraordinary violence that even other killers fear them? These questions don't have easy answers. But in remembering the victims of Joseph Barboza, both those he killed and those he helped wrongfully convict, we must never forget that behind every statistic, every case file, every mob war casualty, there was a human being whose life was cut short, a family that was torn apart, a community that was terrorized. Joseph Barboza died as he lived, violently, suddenly, without mercy or redemption. But his true victims, men like Joseph Salvati and Peter Limone, who spent decades in prison for crimes they didn't commit, they are the ones who paid the highest price for the FBI's deal with the devil. They lost years of their lives, missed their children growing up, buried loved ones while behind bars, all because federal agents decided that keeping Joseph, the animal Barboza, happy was more important than justice. In the quiet moments before those 4 shotgun blasts ended his life, did Joseph Barboza think about his victims? Did he remember the faces of the men he had killed, the lies he had told, the innocent men rotting in prison because of his testimony? We'll never know. What we do know is that in those final seconds, as he walked from his friend's apartment to his car, Joseph Barboza was alone. No FBI protection, no mob backing, no family waiting at home. Just a man with a violent past and no future, about to meet the fate that had been stalking him since the day he chose violence over every other path life offered. The animal was dead, but the damage he had done would echo through the decades, a reminder that when we unleash monsters to fight monsters, innocent people always pay the price.